Today, we become legends.
As games progress, new characters, items, and mechanics almost must be stronger than older ones to incentivize players to try these new things rather than what they're familiar with. In competitive games like Smite, having a character, game plan, or build that you're used to and know the mechanics of will give you a big edge against someone trying something new for the first time. Practice makes perfect after all, therefore power creep is almost inevitable in live service games that get updated frequently, aka most multiplayer games in 2022, so today I'm going to cover 10 of the most blatant and sometimes needless examples of power creep throughout the history of Smite. But first, my definition of power creep may vary from yours, so to clear things up, power creep to me has to be direct. A new god releasing stronger than an old god isn't necessarily power creep, but a new god releasing with an ability that is extremely similar to an old one but way better or with more effects, that is power creep in my view. Thor's wall getting damage is not the kind of direct power creep I'm talking about in this video, that's just an old god getting more effects added to keep up. That is much more similar to bloat, which is just the general shoving of way too many mechanics into one ability. These two terms seem to get used interchangeably, but they're not quite the same thing. But with all that said, let's jump in with our first blatant entry of Smite power creep, which is also the most recent one on the list, and that's Ishtar's 1 power creeping Hachiman's 1. This might be one of the most egregious entries on the list, and looking at these two abilities side by side makes me feel bad for Hachi mains. Ishtar's version has a lower cooldown, gets more basic attacks in total, Hachiman's is limited to 4, and even with 1.0 attack speed, Ishtar can get 6 out because it lasts 6 seconds. At 2.0 attack speed she gets 12, and at the attack speed cap she gets 15, almost 4 times as many as Hachi gets. The range on Stormshot is the same as Eagle Eye, so no change there. Ishtar gets faster projectile speed to make it easier to hit those long range shots. And she has a 40% attack speed buff which makes up for the 15% damage reduction on these shots and Hachiman's own 30 damage increase that falls off at further ranges. Even if I stop there, Ishtar's version is clearly way better, but she also has access to the other two variants in Strike Shot and Spread Shot, which are useful in their own right for wave clear and up close single target damage respectively, giving this ability infinitely more utility than Eagle Eye could even dream of. Pretty much the only area of Hachiman's version of this steroid that is better is the mana cost, which is nothing to write home about considering Hachi's passive gives him practically infinite mana anyway. This is definitely one of the most blatant and direct examples of Smite power creep, and probably one you all thought of when you saw this video and you're recommended. But moving on, we have a slightly less recent release with Tsukuyomi's 2 power creeping Susano's 1. Now, Susano's 1 is already a super good ability, so the fact that Tsuku's 2 can be better than that is kinda nuts. These abilities share a pretty striking resemblance in their 3-hit nature with mobility attached, however Tsuku's version does significantly more damage and has 2 different forms of CC, one of which is a 1.4 second stun, which is really powerful. Now there is a counterpoint with this one that Susano's 1 has AA cancels, which is a huge deal and makes up for the damage differential between these two abilities, but overall Tsuku's just has way more effects and is stronger. Plus, at release this ability was disgustingly good, with added knock-up immunity, way more damage that pretty much nullified the whole AA cancel argument, and the disarm lasted 2.5 seconds at release, which is just nasty. Susano mains were crying when Tsuku released for sure. Next up we have a pretty simple one, and that's Charybdis 3 power creeping Sol 3. Like the previous one, Sol 3 is another ability that is already really good, so power creeping it is kind of insane to think about. However, Charybdis 3 does just that, giving the immunity instantly rather than having to wait 3 seconds like Sol has to, as well as adding a knock-up if amped. I guess Sol 3 at release when it had haste and a stun would have been better than this, but those effects were removed over half a decade ago at this point, and Charybdis 3 is just a strictly better version of Sol 3 on a very similar archetype. Next up is potentially the most dubious entry on the list, as they're not really directly comparable, but they're fairly close, and that's Yemoja's ult power creeping Odin's ult. So as I said, there are some differences between these, but ultimately they achieve the same goal of trapping enemies, restricting their movement, and allowing your team to follow up with disgusting damage. Yemoja's version of course has the insane Omi regen while active, allowing her to spam out more abilities, akin to Odin having massively increased CDR while in the ring, which now that I say it, I wouldn't hate that, but I suppose it would make these abilities even more similar. Yemoja's damage is more easily confirmed as it's guaranteed when the walls collapse, whereas Odin only gets damage if the enemy escapes the ring via jumping or phantom. The same is true for the slow. Yemoja gets a huge decaying slow guaranteed, whereas Odin only gets that slow if enemies leave the ring early. While Yemoja also gets an added tremble, which while not groundbreaking is still an extra thing for her. Yemoja's walls are also unbreakable and always last the full 4 seconds. Odin's last the same amount of time but can be broken by 5 basic attacks. Odin's version isn't without its own benefits though, which is why I'm saying this one is a little bit more dubious than others on the list. With the obvious 100% anti-heal in the ring being super strong as a counter, but has become less valuable over time as anti-heal has become stronger on items and abilities. Odin also gets a power increase for killing enemies in the ring, which is nice too. Yeah, as I said, these two abilities do have their own unique strengths versus each other, but I think overall Yemoja's is just better in most circumstances, and the only time you really want Odin's version is against a healer or very strong lifesteal, which is a somewhat specific counter situation. In general, Yemoja's ult is quite a bit better at doing the same job. Moving into a less nuanced entry though, next up we have Shiva's 3 power creeping Nemesis 1. These abilities are strikingly similar, both being a double dash, however that's pretty much where it ends for Nem's version. Other than using abilities and basic attacks in between which Shiva can't do, this has no other advantages to speak of versus Pillar of Dawn. Whereas Shiva's 3 has 30% damage mitigation while channeling, immunity to all CCs except stuns and Olorun ult, plus a damage aura in destruction mode or up to 3 block stacks in bliss mode. This is just an insane amount of extra effects to add on top of Nem's version, which, let's face it, she's an old god without too many effects on each ability, and Shiva is part of the new era of gods that come with 4 different mechanics on each ability. Fun fact also, Nem dash was never intended to just be a double dash. You were supposed to have to hit someone with the first dash to get the second one, similar to Lance one, but due to a bug on release, you could just double dash always. The community preferred it this way and it was made a feature. Moving on to a super old one though, and that's Sylvanus 3 power creeping Arachne's original ultimate before her rework. So for those that don't know, Sylv's 3 was a repurposed Arachne ability from way back in the day that was actually her ult. It worked in the exact same way except it also did damage. Given the change to Thor, how long will it be before Sylvanus' 3 is also doing damage, let's be real. But that's where the benefits end for Arachne's version and the drawbacks begin. Aside from the damage, this ability had a 30-second cooldown versus Sylv 3's cooldown of 13 seconds at max rank, and of course, most importantly, Nature's Grasp doesn't take up Sylvanus' ult slot, whereas Cocoon did take Arachne's. This is a huge deal of course, as ults are the most powerful and god-defining abilities you have. Imagine if Nature's Grasp was actually Sylvanus' ultimate and he had another basic ability in its place, he'd be so much worse. While it was fun back in the day to lay down 5 egg pods and pull an enemy through the wall into all of them and one-shot them, this ability was hardcore power creeped when it was repurposed for Sylvanus, and unlike most entries on this list, I'm happy it was. Since Arachne's original ult was really not that good and works far better as her basic ability with something more impactful in the ult slot. Bringing it back to more recent bloated gods though, we have the Mounters. Lancelot's 3, power creeping Awilix's 1. Another of the more blatant ones on the list I think, as Lance 3 does the exact same thing as Suku but better and with more effects and choices. Fun fact by the way, Lance's horse is named Bubbles, and boy does Bubbles blow Suku out of the water. Similar movement speed, similar cooldown and similar movement restrictions, with Mount Up giving the added health shield, immunity to all CCs except stuns and time dilation, which at launch was straight up immunity to everything due to a bug, I'm sure you guys remember that, plus 2 dismount options, both of which are better than Awilix's 1 option that she has. The most comparable is Lance's 2 option, which jumps and deals damage, very much like Awilix's, but with a bit less horizontal range but more vertical range for more immunity frames, plus more damage and the short route, and of course he has the ranged option in Shining Gallop, which goes through walls and will slow on hit for more follow-ups. Not only is Lance's version strictly better at everything Awilix's version can do, he also has that extra dismount option to cover range, one of the most clear-cut examples of power creep that exists in Smite for sure. So from a very clear one to a perhaps more dubious one, we have Erlang's 1 versus Fenrir's 2. So when you actually think about it, these two steroids are quite similar after Erlang's rework. The damage on Erlang's is comparable to the power on Fenrir's. Sure, the power applies to Fen's other abilities too, but the overall damage on Erlang's 1 will be higher, so that makes up for it in my opinion. The lifesteal is a bit lower on Erlang's, but the damage reduction on enemies covers that, since if the enemy is dealing less damage to you in the first place, it won't matter that you're healing a bit less. In theory at least. And of course, physical lifesteal only applies to basic attacks anyway, so Fenrir's lifesteal is equivalent to Erlang's here. But Erlang's key strength that he has over Fenrir here is that native cooldown reset by basic attacking that means this ability has what is effectively a 4 to 5 second cooldown when you're fighting compared to Fen's 13 seconds. Again, this one is a little dubious, but after looking at these two abilities side by side, they are pretty damn similar after the rework, but Erlang's just has more effects and is overall better. Next up we have Arthur's launch 85 energy ultimate versus Ne Zha ult. Nowadays these abilities aren't far off each other after Arthur's ult has taken huge nerfs since launch, however back at its release this was one of the most disgusting examples of power creep, so I had to include it on the list. Of course, these two abilities are pretty damn similar, both being single target banishes with hits in mid-air and extra damage on landing. Arthur's is a bit easier to bead, but of course has a generally lower cooldown, assuming Arthur is fighting and generating energy, which was also easier to do at launch, by the way. Even now you can get 2 of these out in one fight if it drags out and you hit a lot of people with each ability, but at launch it was a regular occurrence to be taken to the skies twice in one team fight by Arthur. However, the major difference here was that Arthur's ult used to deal true damage. Not only 660 base, but also 22% of the target's max HP in true damage. That's more than a fifth of your HP just deleted guaranteed, with 660 extra on top of that. This ability at launch would easily do 50% of your health even if you were a tank, while ignoring all protections and not requiring Arthur to build any power since it was all base and max health damage, no power scaling. Whereas Ne Zha's comparable ult requires a lot of power to do great damage. Again, these abilities nowadays are pretty even in terms of power level, perhaps even Ne Zha's is slightly better, but I had to include this one because of how insane Arthur's ult was at launch while being extremely similar to Ne Zha's in terms of gameplay and use case. And finally, we have Bastet's Huntress of Bast versus Fenrir's Ragnarok Ultimate. This one isn't too egregious, but it is kind of funny that they gave an assassin known for having weak CC a Fenrir ult on a stick that hits from 100 units away. This ability is pretty much the same thing as Fen's, except Bastet doesn't need to put herself in danger to grab the enemy, she can just do it from 100 units away. The carry duration is very similar, plus Bastet also stuns at the start for a bit of extra CC sprinkled in there. But that's all I've got for 10 of the most crazy examples of Smite power creep. Which one do you think was the most offensive? The list isn't ordered, but for me I think it has to be Ishtar's one versus Hachi's one. That ability is just way better in almost every way, and has 2 extra options on top of that. Kinda nuts. But anyways, catch you guys in another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out you nerds.